once again, thank you very much for coming at the end of a week. I'm sure you've had lots to do, but this is a very important day for us in particular, but for, I'm sure, all of you who knew Paul Black, in that we've been feeling for quite a long time now that we need to celebrate the life of such a gifted scholar and somebody who had an effect on the lives and the careers of many of us here. My name's Chris Harrison. I worked with Paul for well over 20 years, nearly 30 years on various projects. And there are various people here who've worked with him at different times. What we're going to, how the session is going to run is we're going to first of all hear from Mary Jane, one of Paul's only daughter. He's got sons here as well today, and one of his sons, Simon, is at home with Paul and Paul's wife. But we're going to hear from Mary Jane today, just a little bit that Paul has written so that he can actually greet you. And we hopefully will have them spotlight Paul Black in the background. Can we do that? We're going to spotlight Paul in the background. Simon Black, yes. Oh, the camera's not on. Oh, the camera's on. That's fine. So I'm going to pass over to Mary Jane, who's got a few words from Paul to say to us all before we start. Thank you very much.
Hello, everyone, and thank you all for being here today. And I know if my dad were here, he'd be pleased to see so many of you here today. As Christine said, I'm Mary Jane, Paul's daughter, and I'm here today with 9 other members of the Black family. And my dad, Paul, is joining us from his flat in Cambridge, along with my mum, Mary, and my eldest brother and his wife. So they're very much here with us. I'm just going to say a few words that my dad has asked me to say on his behalf. So these are my dad's words. It is a great pleasure to reflect on my work in education as seen through the eyes of others. As a young academic physicist, I initially approached undergraduate tutorials with trepidation, favouring pragmatic and piecemeal approaches to solving individual problems. Gradually, I became fascinated by how to use a more infused, connected, and holistic approach to help students discover what topics they're most interested in and how to focus and learn about them more effectively. I had little idea then where this journey would take me. The contents of this volume bring home a resulting range of subjects, teaching environments, a range of countries, as well as academic research, government policy, and most importantly, classroom practice. Along the way, I count myself blessed to have worked with so many excellent colleagues. My thanks to all of you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mary Jane. So I'm going to first of all call on Professor Jonathan Osborne, Emeritus Professor from University of Stanford, to say a few words about Paul's contribution to science education.
Okay, Christine, thank you very much. That's all working? You can hear me quite clearly, can you? Well, first thing to say is it is an honor to be invited to do this and to speak about Paul's contribution to education. The simple summary, really, and I'm in some senses directing this to Paul as if he was here, is that this has been an illustrious career, I think, Paul, of which you should be rightly proud. Paul's one of the few scientists who've made the transition successfully from a science discipline to the study of science education. Indeed, I think we would all agree that Paul knows and understands education, both at the policy level and the classroom level, and that combination of the two is unusual, and he does that very well. Now, while many a scientist is wheeled out to comment on science education, or alternatively sit on some science education panel to give it a modicum of respectability, those that have any real expertise and knowledge about science education are a rarity. Now, I've known a few in my time, Carl Wyman, Helen Quinn, and Saul Perlmutter, 2 of whom are Nobel Prize winners, and one of whom is the winner of the Dirac Medal, which is the one below the Nobel. But Paul, I would say, is the most outstanding of these figures in terms of his contribution to education. And I hope I can explain why. Now, Paul started his professional career as a card-carrying scientist. Few of you may know that Paul completed his PhD in crystallography at the Cavendish Laboratory in 1954, when it was run by the famous crystallographer Lawrence Bragg, and where the work on unraveling the structure of DNA by Crick and Watson had just been finished. Unfortunately, I cannot remember Paul's comments about Crick and Watson, but they were interesting. You might like to know, Paul, that about 8 years ago, I met the now head of the Cavendish Laboratory and asked him what had happened to it. And he told me that it had now been turned into a building for the humanities. The physics department had moved out. In the process of converting it, they discovered 25 kilograms of mercury underneath the floorboards. So, Paul, I think it's quite amazing that you're still with us from that point on. For the next Paul worked as a physicist for 22 years, but then he started a collaboration with John Osborne on the innovative Nuffield A-level physics course, which led to a developing interest in education. Their joint endeavor was to reinvigorate the teaching of A-level physics in the post-Sputnik society, which was now dominated by Harold Wilson's white heat of the technological revolution. For those of us who taught this course, and I believe there are others like me here, it was a breath of fresh air. With inventive methods like numerical integration and modern topics like entropy and relativity, finally it seemed as if we had entered the modern era. John Osborne once wrote that for any curriculum innovation to be successful, it's important for teachers to take ownership and transform it to make their own. And there's no doubt in my mind from the people I work with in the physics community that that's what happened. We've all really enjoyed teaching Nuffield A-level physics, and for that matter, the Nuffield O-level physics, but that wasn't what Paul was involved in. Now, this obviously led to Paul's transformational decision to leave the physics community and take on the role as Professor of Science Education and Director of the Center for Science and Maths Education at Chelsea College. At this time, this was an epicenter of innovation in science education, and it attracted a host of influential and important figures such as Arthur Lucas, Michael Scher, Philip Adey, Joan Bliss, Guy Claxton, John Barker, and others. Paul's major contribution at this time was to run the Assessment of Performance Unit, essentially a body set up to monitor the state of education in the country by regularly sampling a representative set of students in the country. Would that we still had such an assessment, as do the Germans and Americans, because it would give us a much better objective measure of the state of education now. But the work he did fostered a series of publications and pamphlets and a body of research work that was to be the foundation of many a career, including my own. The work of the Assessment of Performance Unit was to lay the foundation of the next two important contributions that Paul was to make. One was leading the task group on assessment and testing in the late 80s, which established the system of testing in key stages we now have. How it turned out, I think, is sadly a long way from the vision that the group had. But it's perhaps in 1995, after Paul had retired, that his most seminal work was produced in collaboration with Dylan and Wiliam, which had a long-lasting and enduring effect, making the case for the value and importance of a formative assessment. And I believe Dylan and Wiliam will say more about that. All I would say is you can understand that with over 10,000 citations, this is an influential piece of work. Now, personally, I owe Paul an enormous debt of gratitude. After all, he chaired the interview panel which interviewed me for the post of lecturer in science education back in December in 1985. To this day, I'm not sure why they offered me the position when they had a better qualified alternative with a PhD, but they did, and that has changed my life profoundly. And thank you for that decision, Paul. Second, he was my PhD supervisor. Paul, I have to tell you, has a very interesting style of PhD supervision. He never pushes you. He just has faith that you will produce the goods, which 8 years after starting, I did. Thank you for having faith, even though my PhD contained a bit of a critique of some of the work we did together. There were highlights. One of the things I would like to point out is that even then, Paul worked with John Osborne on teaching a course on exploratory data analysis. And this was, again, a wonderful kind of transformative, eye-opening course. Now, those of you who know Paul will know that he's a modest man. He has a kind of wonderful manner of speaking publicly with the volume turned to a level that you can only just hear, but which forces you to listen to the words of wisdom he so eloquently articulates. Much of his thinking is informed by close collaboration with teachers whom he listens to carefully to understand the context and the challenges they face. And that, I think, is a feature of much of Paul's work. He has a great collaborator. He worked with Mike Atkin at Stanford, produced 2 books on curriculum reform, Mark Wilson at Berkeley, who I believe is attending, to help with his thinking on the Bear assessment system, and Christine, obviously, here at King's, to produce books that has made formative assessment a reality for teachers and learners. Paul's thinking and writing has always contained many a pearl of wisdom. Many years ago at a talk at the ASE, Paul, you finished your talk with a quote from Howard's End by E.M. Foster. I've taken the liberty of repeating the quote you used, which appears at the end of the book. Only connect the prose and the passion, and both will be exalted. Passion is what has driven your life's work, first for physics and then for science education. Your fluency with prose and the care and precision that you've applied to the production of reports and papers for both teachers and academics are an example to all of us of how well you have connected both. Reflecting on what I have written and the contribution you have made, one word comes to mind that explains why your contribution has been so exceptional, and that is gravitas. Your knowledge, your care, your passion, and quiet dignity have endowed the field with a leader who has made an exceptional contribution from which we have all benefited. For that, all of us are thankful. Thank you very much, Paul.
Thank you, Jonathan. We're going to have a video from Dylan Wiliam. He's actually at this moment flying over the Atlantic home. He was here in London yesterday, but dates and times did not, unfortunately, not work out. However, he did send a pre-record of what he would have said being here. So although we're missing you, Dylan, and I'm sure Paul will be missing you, we are going to hear your thoughts on Paul's contribution to research world of.
I'm sorry I can't be with you, because when you are watching this, I'll be in a plane flying over the Atlantic. But I've been asked to say a few words about the contributions that Paul has made to the field of assessment. And they're really quite extraordinary. And when I started researching what I was going to say, I remembered a paper that Paul had written in 1963 about reliability and validity in examination assessment in physics. And so we have an extraordinary record of 60 years of contributions to the field of assessment. I think there are several features that make Paul's work very distinctive. The first is, from the very earliest work, a clear focus on progression. What is it that gets better when somebody gets better at something? I think Paul, more than anybody else, was aware of the importance of these issues a long time ago. The fact is that just about anything in education makes very little sense unless you have a clear idea of what it is that gets better when students get better at something. Feedback, for example. Many teachers find it difficult to give feedback because they aren't clear about what the next steps are. And this work on progression was very clear from the early work of the Assessment of Performance Unit. I first met Paul in Chelsea, the old Chelsea school building, which was an outpost of Chelsea College at the time, which housed the graded assessment teams and the science APU team that was based at Chelsea. And I think there are two features that are distinctive about the work of the APU team, particularly with regard to assessment. And it marked it out as very different from the parallel work going on in mathematics. I think, first of all, it was a very strong sense of progression in science, but I think more importantly, a desire to understand the breadth of achievement in science. So the assessment performance unit looked at investigations, whereas the mathematics team focused much more on the procedural aspects. Paul was therefore, not surprisingly, intimately involved with the early work on graded assessment, originally called graduated assessment based on the old music model and the modern languages model, but very quickly Paul's work was crucial in helping the graded assessment teams that were working in Chelsea College, particularly the maths and the science team, in building a model of learning that was focused on helping children improve. That, of course, culminated in the work of the task group on assessment and testing. So Paul was asked to chair this group, and it's very clear from the work at the time, from the documents that the government were published, that what Kenneth Baker, then Education Secretary, expected was a series of benchmarks at age 7, 11, 14, and 16. The problem with that kind of system, as was very clear from the work on progression, particularly the graduated assessment work, was that if a student got an E, or the lowest grade at the age of 7, they would almost certainly get the same level at the age of 11, 14, and 16. In other words, they would come to think of themselves as an E student. And I think the really radical thing that Paul managed to do in chairing the TGAT report was to secure consensus around this idea of a system of levels that would provide a possibility for all students to progress. Building on the work of Carol Dweck on mindset, I don't think many people realize that the work of the TGAT committee, the task group, was actually years ahead of its time in putting into practice the work of Carol Dweck in terms of the power of growth mindsets to harness motivation for students. So the system of 10, later 8 levels that was accepted by the Secretary of State was really quite remarkable and probably unique in the world. New Zealand had something similar, but not, I think, as well developed. And what's really interesting is Paul's vision in terms of presenting that and thinking through all the obstacles meant that it persisted for 20 years. A model that actually was very radical, but was thought through in sufficient depth that it actually provided the backbone of education in England for 20 years. The thing that's forgotten about the TGAT report, and I think that Paul often wishes to remind people of, is that as well as the report itself, 3 months later, the task group published 3 supplementary reports. And they dealt in really quite extraordinary detail with the problems that would need to be solved if this system were to be implemented across the whole country. And I think the really remarkable thing about that work of that committee, and particularly the supplementary reports, is that although there were several difficulties with the TGAT model, people complained about it, the fact is, compared to what? And there's no doubt in my mind that that model provided a really sound basis for encouraging growth among students that survived all the attempts by various people to get rid of it. Ron Deering mounted several reviews of the TGAT level system. The thing that finally killed it, certainly for me, was the insistence of Ofsted on recording the number of pupils making 3 levels of progress, which actually made it almost impossible for schools with low achievers to satisfy that, and trivially easy for schools with high achievers, because the rate of progress depended on the prior achievement of the students. Then, of course, there's the work on formative assessment. And I think people who haven't been involved in that work won't realize just quite how extraordinarily powerful Paul's thinking about this was from the earliest years. So there's a paper written in 1992, Formative and Summative Assessment by Teachers. And that basically laid the blueprint for all the work that followed. I started working on formative assessment, partly because of my experience with graded assessment. But as I began to read around this topic, I realized that Paul had laid all the groundwork earlier. And that culminated in the review that Paul and I wrote that was published in Assessment in Education. and really kind of kick-started a renewed interest in formative assessment. We then got funding from the Nuffield Foundation to do a research project that would actually examine or just explore whether this was going to be possible in the context of real classrooms. And I think what's distinctive about this work, what we call the CMOFAP project, the King's Medway Oxfordshire Formative Assessment Project, is the respect for teachers. I remember Paul giving a presentation to the teachers about the ideas behind formative assessment, what we discovered in our review. And at the time, I think the teachers believed we were operating some kind of perverted model of discovery learning, where we knew what we wanted the teachers to do, but we weren't going to tell them because we wanted to discover it for themselves. And I think after about 3 months, the teachers realized that we did not know what it was that this would look like in their classrooms. We would support them, but they had to figure out a way of doing that. And that's very clear inside the black box. Paul was the main author of that booklet, making it very clear that teachers would have to figure out a way of doing this in their own classrooms. And I think this highlights another feature of Paul's work, which is a deep and abiding respect for the work that teachers do. Many people in educational research believe that if teachers would just do as they were told, we as researchers will find stuff out and we'll just then tell the teachers what to do. And Paul, even though he'd never been a secondary school teacher, was smart enough to understand how hard that job of school teaching is. And that deep and abiding respect, that's that desire to find out what the best teachers do and to make sense of it so we can share it with others, I think is another cornerstone of Paul's work. And the CMOFAC project laid the basis for a load of other projects. We then had the Learning How to Learn project, again, exploring how these issues might be explored at scale. And then finally, and I think possibly most significantly, and work that I wish I'd been involved in because by that time I'd moved to America, is this idea that there's, again, another theme of Paul's work, which is to help teachers resolve the impossible challenges that they're faced with. So my own work has focused more on formative assessment, but I think what's really interesting about the most recent work that Paul has been doing, as well as the theory work that we've done together, is how teachers can integrate the formative and summative functions of assessment in their practice. This constant return to what does this look like in the classroom? This, I think, lends the work a profound power that makes it everlasting. Less well known, of course, is Paul's work on instructional design. He won an award from the International Society for Design and Development in Education for his work on educational design. But I think if I was going to summarize the main contribution that Paul has made, it's an invisible one. It is the leadership that Paul provided when he was head of school at King's, longer than I think anybody else has ever done the job. But then after his retirement, leading teams of people. So actually what is extraordinary is the work that Paul has done continues in the work of the people that he helped support, that he nurtured. And that's why I can't think of anybody whose work has had a more profound impact on the learning of young people all over the world. Literally millions of students have had their school experiences improved because of the influence of Paul Black. Finally, I would just like to record a personal thank you. My career would not have been anything like as successful as it has been, but for Paul's nurturing. He was appointed my appraiser when King's was kind of gently easing its way towards an appraisal system. And I remember when I was still working in the Consortium for Assessment and Testing in Schools, having a discussion with Paul about my career, and I had 2 journal articles, and I thought, I'd been a PGC lecturer, but I thought, I'm going to have to be a researcher if I want a career in the academy. And so I remember talking to Paul and saying, well, I'll try publishing these 2 papers, and if I succeed, I'll pursue a career as an academic. And if I can't get those things published, I'll go and do something else. And Paul supported me, encouraged me, made sure that one of our publications, the 1996 paper, is Wiliam and Black, the only publication that's Wiliam and Black rather than Black and Wiliam. And I think that set me on the road to the career that I've had. So in addition to the extraordinary contributions he's had to education worldwide, I also want to pay great homage and thanks to Paul for the extraordinary influence he's had on my life and my career. Thank you.
So it's a pity that Dylan couldn't be with us here, but I think you're starting to hear already, the accolade from Jonathan, and then in the video that Dylan produced for us, that this was quite an outstanding man who we were working with. And my story is going to say similar things, although it's coming from a slightly different angle. Whereas Jonathan and Dylan spoke about the contributions that Paul has made to research in science education and research in assessment, at the same time talking about how his influence affected what went on in schools. The work that I did with Paul when I started working with him in 1996 was very much school-based. I'd come myself from teaching background, and I was doing my PhD with Paul. Like Jonathan, I remember my supervisions really well. We used to talk for long times. I used to come away and think, right, I need to go and think again. Because although Paul hadn't told me I was going off at a tangent, it was clear from just some of the pointers that he'd said that I needed to start thinking a little bit more deeply. And I think he had this absolute knack of saying things to people without necessarily saying them. So I was really interested when Dylan said about the invisibility. There was some sort of aura about Paul that helped direct you on the right path and the right journey to making progress, to moving things forward, to thinking, yes, something is here that I need to work on and to push forward. And it was pretty clear as a PhD student with him, and I know there are several other people here tonight who also did their PhDs with Paul, that you were expected to really learn from being part of the process. And I was always amazed as we worked in schools with Paul. My main job was on the very first project, the rather oddly named CMOFAP project. It was one of the areas that as a team we were not particularly good at, and that was naming projects. It was actually a temporary one, which we never ever got round to finding a good name for. But there's, we had several other projects after that, like Jaffa for Jersey Action Informative Assessment, and then we did a one on summative assessment with Oxford, which is the COSAP project and so on. None of them maybe had the most appealing of names, but the work that came out of it with teachers has had an outstanding effect on what goes on in classrooms today and what went on in classrooms at that time. And as Dylan says, it's had a marked effect on the lives and chances of students and of teachers and of colleagues here who are part of that research. If I just start off with explaining a little bit about the way Paul worked on these projects. So our very first project, MoFap, Dylan and Paul there, we visited the schools. We had 6 schools, 3 in Oxfordshire, 3 in Medway. Paul Spenceley, my colleague to my right, was one of those teachers, and he's going to speak a little while about what it was like for him at that time and the effect it's had on his life as a teacher. But myself and another researcher, Claire Lee, were going into classrooms and working with the teachers. And the teachers would come in to King's about every 6 to 8 weeks and talk about the things they tried in their classrooms. The absolute skill that Paul had in terms of understanding what went on when he himself had not been in those classrooms watching what went on, but he understood the principles and the processes underneath, and all the time was reasoning out why it was that that works. And in education at the moment, we know that there's a big push to find out what works and to put money and effort into that. Paul Black went much further than that. He didn't want to know just what works, but how and why it worked. And that's what he was always searching for. And that's what he made us collect data on, discuss, talk about, think about. And it's that slow incremental move as we move forward, as we all developed our skills, as we all started to understand what was needed in those classrooms, that meant that this actually worked. The most amazing part of it was he actually anticipated that, as Dylan said, in that booklet inside the black box. There's a quote in there that says, we need to move at a pace that allows teachers to develop these ideas so that it starts to become part of their practice and they start to understand how and why it helps children learn. His focus from an assessment viewpoint was always on learning, and that was unusual at that time in the assessment arena, because most of the research that was being done on assessment in the 1980s and 1990s was looking at measurement and better ways of measuring. Paul could do all of that. He wanted to also know, how can we make it work better in classrooms? How can we move to a way of getting children to think about, so where am I in this journey of moving forward? What progress have I made since the last time I did something like this? And how do my ideas fit or differ from those other students in the classroom? And what does that mean about the way that I move forward and the way that I think and the way that I try things out? He was very, very aware of social interactions between people, dialogic teaching, and of many of the other innovative ways of moving learning forward that have come to the fore since Inside the Black Box was published in 1990. After the various projects on formative assessment started, and these moved through many of the local education authorities around then in England, had a large project in Scotland and was working through the local authorities there. But the books that we wrote at that time have also been translated into other languages. And so it continued to work across Scandinavia, in Poland, in Korea, and various places. And at the same time, Paul was very aware of similar work being done in places like New Zealand with Beverly Bell and Bronwyn Cowie. And what he did was to bring people together so that they could talk more and learn more. Paul was someone who always wanted to listen, to think, and then to discuss ideas with you, because that's how he saw that things move forward. And that was the way he worked, whether he was working with professors like Beverly Bell from Waikato University in New Zealand, or whether he was actually working with primary school teachers, as he was when we were doing our project in Jersey. He was interested in people's ideas, the way they interpreted the ideas and what they brought to it. And I think the greatest strength of Paul Black, and I hope you're listening, Paul, is that you have faith in people. You believe that they can do things. You give them the strength and impetus to have a go at things. And the one thing that is, I think, outstanding in the way that you treat people is you're always willing to allow people to come back and talk again. And for someone who was, running a school of education, who was doing, leading research, who had big research projects, you were always the most approachable of people. And I think that really counted at all levels with the people that you actually work with. After we'd done a number of projects on assessment, we then moved back into the area that Paul and I both come from, and that was into science education. So in more recent years, my team at King's, with Paul as part of that, started doing some European projects looking at investigations. It's gone full circle. This was one of the things he was interested in early on, as Dylan said in his part, where he was really interested in, how do we assess things differently? Why do we have to assess things in the way that we're always doing? Is there a better way of doing it? And this allowed him to go back to those early days when he was a physics lecturer himself, and to rethink how might we do it differently if we're going to look in a more investigative way in classrooms. And we've got Natasha Surratt and Katrina Korai here who worked with him on some of those ideas on the COSAP project, and then on the project, the sales project, and then the Assist Me project that we did, the European projects. And what was always outstanding in the way that Paul worked is when we went to work with teachers overseas. Not only was he very good at doing at working with teachers here in the UK, she's also very good at listening to their cultures, to their contexts, and working out how assessment worked in their classrooms, and why perhaps what we were doing with our teachers here in England maybe wouldn't work with the teachers who were working in the Czech Republic, or would work differently for teachers who were working in Hungary. And that cross-fertilization of ideas helped us all to understand better what were the principles, what were the ingredients, where was the focus we really needed, who were going to take things forward. So when we talk about teachers in schools today needing to have research-informed practice, Paul was master. He understood that research-informed didn't just mean telling teachers some research, send them out to take that research and make it work in their classrooms. He was very aware that we also needed to see how that played out, how what teachers did fed back into our research, and that reciprocity that he actually had of allowing us to learn from teachers just as teachers learned from us as researchers, developed a collaborative environment that was rich and useful for us all. So it's not surprising that we moved into when Paul eventually did properly retire. I mean, he retired once and then did all of this work, but then when he did properly retire and moved away from his house in Wimbledon and moved to Cambridge, it's not surprising that we were already thinking of, how do we actually draw all these ideas together? And that's why we produced the book that we're here to celebrate today, and I'll come back to that after Paul Spenceley spoke. But I'm sure that there are people out there online, and it's maybe coming on chat, and we will respond to the people on chat after today. But there's a number of people who took some of the ideas, whether it be formative assessment, whether it be some of the science ideas that Paul worked on, and started to develop in their own work. So Paul has had a worldwide effect on students and the way that they learn, both in science, other subjects, particularly in the way that assessment works within classrooms. So I'm going to pass over to Paul Spenceley. Paul was in one of our Medway schools on our MOFAT project, and he has kept in touch ever since, because what actually happened during that project and the way that Paul Spenceley worked with Paul Black and the rest of us actually affected what he did in his own teaching and learning, but it's been of great use to us when we start working with other teachers. So Paul comes back regularly. He's been back this year to talk to my new teachers on our PGCE course who are just going into the profession to hear about how assessment, when you work with people like Paul Black, can have a marked effect on the way that you teach and the way that children learn. So I'm going to pass over to Paul.
Thank you, Chris. Can everyone hear okay? Yeah. Okay, right. So my name's Paul Spenceley. I usually wander up and down, so I'm not very comfortable sitting and speaking, so apologies. But I'm going to basically explain how my life story fits in with this evening, and it comes in three sort of roughly 20-year chunks, starting in 1977. I became the first person from my family, from my whole family, to ever go to university. So I chose my placement because it was very close to the football ground of the team I supported. So I headed off to Chelsea College. Brilliant. I'm doing a degree in biology and education. First year at uni was amazing, as it usually is for people. All sorts of things happened. It was a great place to be doing sort of work. Two things though. One of the things, I went to see the first Star Wars film in 1977. God, that was a long time ago. But also in 1977, my first year there, a physics lecturer called Paul Black was appointed to me as my personal tutor. It seemed a bit random because I was doing biology and education. Now I have to say, out of those two events, the Star Wars film had a little bit more impact at the time. Apologies, Paul. But neither of them did I think would be in any way relevant to my life 40 years later. So let's fast forward 20 years on. It's the late 1990s. I'm teaching in what Tony Blair was going to call a bog standard comprehensive school in Medway. I thought I was a pretty good science teacher. My students liked me, got good results, parents liked me, got on well with my peers. I thought I was pretty sure I was where I needed to be as a science teacher. But suddenly, Paul Black descended back into my life. And we had this ridiculously named King's Medway Oxfordshire Formative Assessment Project, which I've always thought of as the working inside the black box project. And as Chris said, Paul, Dylan, and Chris herself worked with us over a period. Now, to say the impact of Paul Black that time was immeasurable to what it had been the first time I'd met him. Basically, my teaching completely and utterly changed in every way you could possibly imagine. Now, I could talk to you about it literally all night, which Chris knows. But in a nutshell, Paul's project made me realize it made no difference at all whether I was a very good science teacher or the best science teacher in the world. What mattered was not whether I taught well, but whether my students learned well. And that was completely different. And that changed every aspect of what I did as a teacher. So, for example, planning lessons stopped being about what I was going to teach, but started being about what would make my students learn better. My discussions became opportunities in a lesson for students to be able to show what they'd learned and listen to what other people had learned. Even my feedback, instead of being moaning, became something where I started saying to students about what they'd learned and how they could progress that learning. And as time went on, I began to develop links between summative and formative assessment, because it used to annoy me that summative assessment was just a grade, go away, right, there you go. So I worked on all sorts of things that would mean that when students got their summative tests back, they actually got a whole range of information about what specific things they'd learned well, what specific things they needed to learn better in order to make further progress. And so it continued. Over the next 20 years, I changed out of all recognition of what I'd been as what I thought was a fairly successful science teacher. Not only did I change in my teaching and the teaching in my schools, but I spent most of that 20 years going to other schools around the country, talking about assessment for learning, as the King's project had sort of morphed into. Now, I know Dylan would have words with me because he'd say, that's not the same as formative assessment, but basically that's what we were using as the term. I spoke all sorts of places. I ended up on TV. I became the first teacher, would you believe this, the first teacher to be on a committee for the Department for Education. They'd never had a classroom teacher on a committee before. You know, there's one for the record books. Anyway, all the time I was talking about assessment for learning. So we move on. It's the end of the 2010s. I've recently retired and we get locked down. Now, everyone else got a puppy. I decided I'd write a book. And I wrote my book, Successful Science Teaching, which basically tries to sum up everything that I'd learned from Paul and his team and developed over those years. And I still can't believe that all this time later, you know, that still mattered that much to me, that I felt, you know, I'm out of teaching now, I want to put it down and pass it on. As it happened, went to see the last Star Wars film as well, you know, and who would have thought that all those years later, I'd still be seeing Star Wars, but much more importantly, I'd still be sort of depending on Paul Black. Now, just before, I know you're keen to get to the food, and I know Chris wants to wind up, but very quickly, there's a whole range of people here, but I feel there's a big group of people missing. So I'd like to say on their behalf, that's the tens of thousands, probably millions of students around the world who have had better science grades directly as a result of the work that Paul Black did. And as a result of those better science grades, have had increased life chances, So from every single one of them, as well as me, thank you, Paul.
Thank you very much. I'm going to talk about the book a little bit, but I just want to say to Melissa, can you just check on the food and drink? That should be coming. Yeah, because we should be finishing in 5-10 minutes. Okay. Okay, that's fine. Thank you. So what we decided to do, again, as just before lockdown, was to actually celebrate Paul's great contribution that he's made to both science education and to assessment, but particularly to what's the work that's gone on in schools. And so the idea was to pull together people who he'd influenced and get them to write about how they were using his ideas now, or how their ideas had been changed by Paul, as we've got in the case of this Paul here, and to write about what that now meant, how they thought compared to how they thought before. And that's why when we came up with this idea of this Festschrift, a Festschrift is very popular in parts of Europe and particularly in the US, when you've got a distinguished scholar like Paul Black, to get others to write about how his work has influenced them. And so we began, we sent around an email to various people we know had worked with him before and asked them if they wanted to contribute a chapter. And we got an enormous number of people actually replying. And apologies to those of you who didn't reply and we didn't get back to. We just had enough to fill a book straight away. And we could actually possibly have moved on to a second and third volume if we'd actually searched through all the people that have worked with Paul and that he has influenced. With David Pepper and Constant Lung here at King's, we've been working with these authors over that time. It's quite interesting, having just gone through the first proofs of the book and then going back to the editors, to realise that Paul Black has had an influence in a great number of ways. So we've got people who worked for examination boards and Ofqual writing chapters. We've got people who've done a lot of moderation work in various states in Australia, working closely in teachers in a very different area, Queensland, to the type of context that we've got here in the UK with assessment and with teaching and learning. We had people who were working on similar things as Paul way back in the 1990s and are still working on it. So we've got a chapter from Broncowie in New Zealand. But we've also got chapters from people whose careers started because of Paul's work with him. So we've got a chapters by Natasha and Kat Hirst, and Natasha Surrett and Katrina Korai, about how they see Paul's work, not just how it's influenced them and how it's gone on, but how it's actually influencing moving forward ideas in terms of professional learning. So Paul Black has had a dramatic effect, and the Festschrift, we hope, tells us something of that story. You probably have found on your seat that there is a flyer for it. The book will not be out until the early autumn. It's actually undergoing the final stages of being edited now. But it is a book that I think is well worth people getting, not just to know more about Paul Black, but to know about the culture and the historical context that went on as assessment and science education changed during the 1990s and into this millennium. I think one of the things it did for me reading through was to make me realise just how innovative and groundbreaking Paul's work has been. But also it actually, I think, will help scholars of the future. So those of you here, and I know we've got some people here who are on master's courses at the moment at King's, will be helping future master's students when they start to get round to, as some of you guys are doing at the moment, writing their dissertations. Because this is a book that's full of chapters by leading authors who know what's happening, who know what works in terms of assessment, who know what the problems are, but also know about the challenges, the dilemmas and the opportunities that are there. And so it will create, I think, a very useful tool as we move forward into the future. So I want to thank everybody who's come here this evening to celebrate the life and works of Paul Black, but also those of you who are joining in online to say, you know, we all are really delighted to produce the festschrift. We're all really delighted there's going to be something that marks the work that Paul did with others. But I think for me and for others here, the endearing thing about Paul Black is that he's going to live on in all our hearts and with all our minds. Because if you've ever worked with somebody like Paul Black, you know that it changes the way that you work, but also changes the way that you think and the way that you respect people. I've never met a man who not only is so modest, but also is so caring. And I want to thank you personally, Paul, for all the work and all the support you gave me during my time as I was doing my PhD, but also afterwards on various projects, because you were always the one that you could go back to and to say again, can we just talk that through, Paul? And he would be there thinking and helping you find the solution. So you came out feeling that you had achieved when really he was practicing what he's known for, and that's formative assessment. He's given you guidance so you knew what next steps to take. And that's one of the values that Paul Black has always held dear and always worked with all of us. So I would like to say just one more time, thank you, Paul, for all the work that you've done. And in a moment, we're going to break away, enjoy some lovely food, a glass of wine, and leave you to enjoy what we sent you to have with your family there in Cambridge, and to say that we're all thinking of you, and we'll all want you to sign our books when we next see you. So thank you very much. Bye.